The following program is brought to you by TZ Productions, celebrating KPTS's nearly 50 years of community support in South Central Kansas. Great starts here on KPTS.
Our guest list is the who's who of Kansas personalities and power players. It's your chance to get to know the person behind the persona. This week, we go one-on-one with a well-known Kansan who is literally wise beyond his years, when it comes to Kansas history, that is. And Jay Price is a rock star. He chairs the history department at Wichita State University, but his classroom extends far beyond campus. Price is one of the state's most prolific authors of books about the past. He is frequently interviewed for news stories and documentaries, and often gives public lectures. His knowledge and perspective helps keep the important lessons of history alive while captivating those with a bent for nostalgia. Price is clearly the go-to guy for all things history. But what does he say about these days we're living in now? And what is his greatest fear for the future? We'll talk about that and much more as we go one-on-one with Dr. Jay Price right now. Hello and thanks for tuning in. I'm Victor Hogstrom. I'm excited to welcome the brilliant and interesting Dr. Jay Price to the program. Welcome.
Thank you for allowing me to be here today.
Oh, it's a pleasure having you. You have so much to say and so many stories to tell, and the audience is just waiting to hear it all.
Well, I'll see what I can do, thanks.
So let's begin. You are a historian. You studied history.
Yes.
Why history and why this fascination with history?
I think the interest in history for me began when I was a little kid, and when my grandparents would take me for the weekend, instead of reading me bedtime stories, they would lay down and tell me stories about what it was like when they were growing up. And so I had this personal connection with life in the 1930s, and my grandfather would talk about World War II. I was mainly interested in the troop ship at the time, but he would allow me to ask questions, and I think that's what it really got started.
You are from Santa Fe, New Mexico.
Yes.
Your father was a veterinarian, and they would tell you historical stories?
Mom and Dad would definitely take me to museums. That was something we did an awful lot. And then when we would go back to Michigan, they would introduce me to relatives, and they would take me around places where they grew up. In fact, there was a time I was a little kid, and I was so tired of them showing off where they grew up that I started pointing out any house I liked and said, well, I used to grow up here, and I used to grow up there, just because I was so used to them talking about it.
So you grew up in Santa Fe,
I
New
did.
Mexico. Tell us about those growing up days.
Santa Fe is an interesting town to grow up because you have all these different cultures together. My parents are transplants, again, from Michigan, but you have these deep-rooted populations from the Native American background, the Latino background, and culture and heritage is something that's celebrated. And so seeing that interaction was really eye-opening, and it allowed me to have a real appreciation for history, the past, how it's part of daily life today, and how different interpretations of that past can reside in the same location.
So how did you end up in Kansas?
I went to my undergraduate at the University of New Mexico, then off to William and Mary, then to my PhD program at Arizona State. After that, I worked for the Army for a couple of years looking at Asian American World War II veterans out in California. When that project was winding down, the opportunity to come out and direct what was then called the Public History program at Wichita State had emerged. And when I applied, I was able to get that position. I came out here in 1999 and have been part of the history department here ever since.
But you seem to be, Doc, an expert in South Central Kansas history, especially Wichita. How did that develop?
Well, I was able to function under the guidance of Craig Miner, who really is the premier historian of our era of Wichita and South Central Kansas. His office was right next to mine. And so he allowed me to learn from him. He allowed me to get involved in a number of topics and gave me advice and ideas. And I could not have done this without the support of people like Craig and others in the community pointing me into a number of directions. And then I found that there was this wonderful, rich community and set of stories to develop. I've long said that Kansas is a place that if you give it a chance, it'll give you a chance.
Mm-hmm. So what have you found that is unique about the history of Kansas that sets it apart from other states, the history of Wichita that sets it apart from other cities?
Kansas has this really complicated heritage. We are right at that intersection where the North and the South and the East and the West and the Southwest all combine, and we have elements of all of those stories in one location. And Wichita is that distilled, I think, to an even greater degree. One of the things, though, that's intriguing for me coming from New Mexico in regards to Wichita is that up until World War II, Wichita was convinced entirely that it was part of the Southwest. It identified with the Southwest. And this meant the greater Texas area, the Great Plains, and then tied into the desert Southwest. So I love seeing that connection. The other thing that's fascinating about Kansas is that it's a place where there's so much history hidden in plain sight. All these different communities are functioning, vibrant, interact with each other in different ways. I've come to say that Kansas isn't really a state as much as it is an archipelago.
Well, what does that mean?
Well, if you're flying over a group of islands, especially at night, you see little pockets of light separated by darkness, these little communities. Kansas is that way too. You'll have a community that is primarily Volga German right next to a community that is African American, right next to a community that is Swedish or Czech or Hispanic. And the two have entirely different stories, and it's almost like they're these self-contained islands that interact with each other and yet are distant. When you're traveling in Kansas, you can even navigate using those grain elevators almost like lighthouses. And so that interaction has been fascinating to observe.
So how analytical are historians?
Historians look at the past probably in a way different from a lot of the general public. The general public tends to think that history is a collection of names and dates and facts and places, and that you have to memorize vast quantities of facts. Professional historians tend to look at trends. We tend to look at the connections between the facts, the larger stories as they unfold. And so it's what ties all that together that makes the study of history so fascinating, the cause and effect and the different narratives and the different understandings of what makes the past.
But compared to science, is history exact?
Historians today would not say so. There was a time when historians tried to be scientific and tried to get back to the as it actually was, wie es eigentlich gewesen ist, as the German scholars would have put it. Today we understand more that it's about story. It's about different interpretations. You can have a fact that is established in the past, that is established in the record, but what does that mean? What's the significance of it? And that depends on where you are. Our understanding of the past is really connected in some ways to the understanding of memory. Just as we remember things in different ways depending on who we are, depending on our circumstances or the lens we put on it, the past really functions that way as well. So the idea that there is a single concrete, unbiased past versus distorted visions oversimplifies things. There are different narratives that can be equally true at the same time. And in fact, that's one of the things you'll find, especially when you look at a community, that you might have a similar event and both sides or multiple sides view it very differently and yet can be right also simultaneously.
Right, right. You talked about memory. How do historians view the past as opposed to the general public?
We tend to view the past as a lens on today, on the present. You have to look at who is telling the story. A key principle for the study of history is there's no such thing as a fact or a source that's produced without a context, and there's no such thing as a fact or a source or an event that is interpreted without a context. And so context setting is absolutely essential. And that's something that I think a lot of folks in the general public, when they remember from their K through 12 years, they remember here's A, B, C, and D, and this is the way it is. Well, it's a little more fluid than that. The reality is the past does not exist. The past is gone. We have to recreate it based on how we understand things. This goes back to Price's law of history. History is not written by the winners. It's written by the survivors. What survives is what we remember. And a lot of times those are the winners, but a lot of times the losers actually have more of a vested interest in preserving the past than the winners. The winners are busy winning. So if you take, for example, a major department store downtown that burns and the records are lost, and compare that with this little tiny grocery store whose family kept those records in great detail and lovingly preserved them, whose story gets told?
Right.
And that, I think, is something that historians always have to wrestle with. We have to realize that what is out there is not representative of everything that had happened. All we're getting are a sampling of what has survived.
Now, you've been involved in several historical projects within the greater Wichita, South Central Kansas community.
Right.
But there was one project that I was fascinated by when you shared it with me, and it's all about the musicians of Wichita.
Yes.
Tell us about it.
Sure. Well, the project began with a discussion with a number of rock musicians here in town who wanted to preserve their story. And what emerged was that Wichita had a vibrant, very active live music scene in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And there are a whole number of bands that helped fuel that. We had a lively club scene. We had a whole host of activities and events. And so this was an attempt to document these musicians and their stories.
And it's called Wichita Rock and Roll.
Wichita Rock and Roll, 1950 to 1980.
Tell us about some of the artists in this book.
Sure.
Who are some of these star singers that we know of and some we don't know of?
Sure. We tend to think of big stars, people like Joe Walsh of the Eagles, who has definite Wichita connections. But a lot of these bands are actually more regional, local bands. So you have the Board of Regents and the Surfs, Mike Finnegan, very, very significant. Jerry Wood and the Pegs, very, very significant. And then we have a whole host of bands that go through a series of metamorphoses. They'll change names over time and so forth. And then finally you have bands like the Clocks that helped pioneer the music video format in the 1980s coming out of this. So it's really the story of a whole generation of musicians, their fans, and their supporters.
So what else are you involved in?
Well,
that you can be very proud of?
Well, being involved in local history has been a great privilege. I've often said that I don't pick topics, topics pick me. And so being involved in local topics has been something that I've enjoyed developing. So not too long before the Wichita book came into being as a project, I learned about the 150th anniversary of the Chisholm Trail, which was going to be celebrated in 2017. And as I was part of the planning process for that, an idea came for a mascot of sorts. What would a longhorn be like in terms of talking about this? And so then I said, well, it's a little awkward for Longhorn to be talking about going to the processing plant. So, well, what would the story look like? And in that moment, Luke entered my life. And Luke the Longhorn, a character, emerged as the subject of a graphic novel, a comic book, if you will, a visual representation of Wichita history. So I was really pleased, sure, to work with a team of students, a team of students from the history department as well as students who have education and graphic design backgrounds to create this first of a trilogy of graphic novels. This one tells the story of Jesse Chisholm and the founding of the Chisholm Trail, the founding of Wichita, why we're called Wichita. Book 2 will be about the Wichita Park City rivalry, and then Book 3 will be about the creation of Wichita as a cow town. It was a real honor to be part of this, in part because I could connect with so many different individuals, among them descendants of the family of Jesse Chisholm.
Okay.
And one of the great privileges I had was being able to show proofs of this to one of the descendants of Jesse Chisholm, herself a little girl, as she was able to look at what her ancestor did and feel a sense of pride. Wow, this is what he did. Chisholm was more than just the namesake to a trail. He was this go-between between so many different individuals and a very important and significant individual. It was great to be able to talk about that.
Okay, so let's play this little game that I always play on this program.
Sure.
I will read a phrase to you and you respond to it. And the phrase would be about the most challenging in your life regarding, the first one, your personal life.
The biggest challenge in my personal life is finding balance. I like to be active, I like to be involved, and finding the time to disconnect, to not overcommit has been a lifelong challenge personally. Just doing too much is one of those things I wrestle with all the time.
Your teaching life.
The biggest challenge in my teaching life is that there's so much to talk about and explain and help students get involved in telling their own stories. There just isn't time to do it all. And I wish that I could spend a lot more energy fleshing things out, but there's so much to cover at once.
Your growing up days, your childhood.
For me, one of the biggest challenges was finding my place in a place like Santa Fe. New Mexico is a community where even being born there doesn't make you a local. That was something that the old families have a rootedness and an appreciation for their connection there. So I felt a little like a native-born foreigner in Santa Fe, and finding that although I was born there, I wasn't fully of the community, and so I always wrestled with that. But I think that wrestling is what prompted me to start looking at topics and communities who are part of a place, but maybe a little bit different, or might have a slightly different story than the larger narrative.
Your goals?
Again, the biggest challenge, I think, for my goals is finding the right balance. I sometimes say in doing research, it's like the old slogan for 7-Eleven, too much good stuff. There's so much out there, and I know I'm not going to have time to be able to do it all. And there's such a richness out there that finding the realization that other people are going to have to take their own stories and run with that and allow them to do that is a ongoing goal for me.
What is the biggest challenge you found in American history?
The biggest challenge in American history is we get too focused on a handful of big topics. For a lot of people, my students in general, history consists of Civil War, World War II, maybe Vietnam, maybe the 20s, and not a lot else. And telling people to look beyond World War II or look beyond Civil War. Not that those aren't significant and important, but there's an awful lot else to look at. And I think a lot of people are open to this, but it's not that they're not interested in these other topics, it's that they're not aware that these are other topics. And to expand that, broaden that horizon is part of what I have to do.
The Great Plains.
The challenge of the Great Plains is that we were founded as a series of communities to meet a certain need, to produce agricultural products, to be real estate opportunities, to serve railroads, and those networks have changed, and that the populations who served communities 100 years ago are not the same communities now. So what does the Great Plains look like today? What does it mean for someone who is an immigrant from West Africa living in the Great Plains? What does it mean for someone who is a part of an alternate community, who's part of a new industry, who's part of something that is just developing now? What does that story look like on the Great Plains? And that's just as significant as the story of the 1870s.
Wichita, your greatest challenge in the history of Wichita.
The biggest challenge for Wichita is that we're still finding our role. We're still finding our place. Some cities have a natural reason for existing. San Francisco is on a major harbor. New Orleans is located where ships can access the Mississippi. Denver is located at a pass in the Rocky Mountains. But Wichita doesn't have an inherent rootedness. I've sometimes said we're the bumblebee city. Just as the bumblebee is the insect that shouldn't fly but does, we're the city that in some ways shouldn't be here but does. And so we're now trying to find our role, especially in a new setting, in one that may not always be tied to aviation or to the old industries the way they used to be.
Now, as a historian, Doctor, you probably have a life's philosophy. Historians tend to do that.
I guess.
What's yours?
My life, I guess, as a life philosophy is look for the different stories and appreciate how different interpretations can exist at the same time, and appreciate the power of those different stories that can be markedly distinct from one another and yet valid and absolutely accurate at exactly the same time.
Okay. So this one question I have here is, who are the most historically overrated persons in America or in American history?
There are so many layers to American history. We tend to focus a lot on the major leaders, the movers and shakers. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times we forget the people who supported them. They existed in a context as well. You can look at the CEO, but also look at their administrative assistant who prepared all the files. Look at the individuals who were right around them. And that's where a lot of times the big story comes out. And it's worth looking at those individuals who may not always be present and yet are present at the same time.
So what can we expect from Dr. Price over the next 20 years? What are the plans, the goals, the aspirations, despite the challenges?
Despite the challenges, I look forward to the projects that are still in the works, the projects that are going to come to me and say, hey, I need to be told. The projects that will show up out of the blue with a phone call or an email, hey, did you know about? Or the project that will show up when I work in one topic and then a phone call comes from someone from a topic I had worked on 10 years earlier, and oh, didn't you know thus and such, and continue going from there. So probably the biggest thing is to be open.
So while you're planning the next 20 years, what do you do in your spare time?
As a historian, what I do as a profession and what I do personally overlap in a great degree. So the great opportunity is that the distinction between work and play is murky. What I enjoy doing in terms of reading, doing photographing of architecture, going on trips, model building, are all tied to similar sorts of interests. And yet at the same time, finding time to totally disconnect and go for the walk, or de-stress from projects is important. One of the challenges, I guess, if you will, in a work that I do, is that because working with museums and doing history and going on these types of explorations is part of what I do, to decompress, I have to do things that don't look like that. So sometimes to decompress, I have to not go to a museum. And sometimes it's just being.
So because of history and your knowledge of history and your study of history, how would you define yourself? What has it turned you into?
I think of myself as a historian, in terms of as identity. And I express being a historian in a number of ways. I can teach in the classroom, and absolutely that's part of who I am. But as a researcher, that's another way that I am a historian. Or helping students finding their own genealogy, that's part of it. So I think it expresses itself in a variety of ways.
That's professionally. Personally?
Being a historian has allowed me to appreciate where these connections are and my rootedness, and understanding where I fit in the larger scheme as a Gen Xer coming of age in the American Southwest, with its own particular dynamics, and transplanted to a new location. I've often said that when I drive back to Santa Fe or I drive to Wichita, I go home both directions.
Mm-hmm. Okay. On that note, I think it's been a very interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
For being on One-on-One. It's been a pleasure.
Very much appreciate it. Thank you.
And thank you for watching. If you have a question or comment, we're always interested. oneonone@kpts.org is the email address. We look forward to hearing from you. I'm Victor Hogstrom, and we'll see you next time.
The preceding program was brought to you by TZ Productions, supporting KPTS and the communities it serves in South Central Kansas. Great starts here on KPTS.
Support also comes from viewers like you. Thank you. Call KPTS to receive a DVD copy of this program for a $40 donation. You can also send a check or money order along with the program name, date, and time to the address on your screen. And you will receive a 1-year KPTS membership.